Right, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the 2021 Birds and Renewable Energy Forum. And we're really looking forward to this discussion of ways to support a nature-friendly rollout of renewable energy, not only for birds, but for biodiversity more broadly. So just to give you a bit of an overview of the agenda for the next 2 days. Each day is going to involve 2 sessions, followed by a question and answer session after each of these. Today's focus is going to be firstly on environmental policies, plans, and guidelines for renewable energy in South Africa. And then secondly, on the various spatial tools that are available to support site selection for renewable energy developments. And then tomorrow, we're going to move on to a discussion of issues surrounding operational phase monitoring and mitigation, and then moving beyond mitigation to environmental enhancements. Now, by now, I'm sure most of you are all too familiar with Zoom webinar formats, but we really encourage you, if you have any questions, to include them in the Q&A box at the foot of the screen. And then also just to notify you that just now there will be a poll popping up on your screen. We really encourage all of you to just take a few seconds to answer this. It's just to give us a better sense of the composition of our audience today and the various sectors that you're joining us from. Right, so as I said, today's first session focuses on applicable environmental policy, plans, and guidance. And so for this session, we're really pleased to have presentations from both the South African Wind Energy Association, represented by Rebecca Thomas, and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, represented by Dr. Dee Fisher. We're definitely looking forward to hearing their updates and perspectives. We're also pleased to be joined by Samantha Ralston-Payton from BirdLife South Africa and Kate Richardson from the South African Bats Assessment Advisory Panel to hear about their respective guidance and advice. And then also by Christy Bragg to learn a bit more about what's needed for sustainable renewable energy in the Karoo. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into the presentations. They are all going to run back to back. And as I said, please do post your questions in the Q&A box so that those can inform the live discussion a bit later. Thanks very much. Sam, can you roll the video?
Association, and I've been asked today to give an update and perspective from the South African Wind Energy Association regarding various updates around the industry. So the presentation structure for today, I'll be covering general industry updates, then talking a little bit about the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program Bid Window 5 outcomes, otherwise known as the REAP program. Then I'll be covering a summary of the full REAP program to date, looking at the numbers, megawatts, projects awarded, etc. We'll then follow that with a quick recap of the Integrated Resource Plan, which was gazetted in 2019. So looking at what's still planned to come onto the grid from a renewable energy perspective. Then move on to policy and guideline developments. Just since 2019, new guidelines, new policy that's come into place that impacts the industry. We'll also include blade painting update there. And lastly, just end off with a current outlook of the wind industry in SA, where we feel it's going. Starting with the general industry updates or changes that have occurred in the last couple of years. I'm just going to click through them and then talk through them. So first off, not a major change, but we had the reconfiguration of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries and Department of Environmental Affairs back in, I think, 2019. They then became DEF, Department of Energy, Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, and there was a slight change following that to Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. So now DFFE, still with Barbara Creasy appointed as the minister there. Quite a major update last year was the appointment of Bernard Makoro as the new head of the Independent Power Producer Office in April 2020. He essentially replaced Karen Breitenbach, the former head, and acting head advocate Sandra Kutsia. Then key updates this year, and essentially kept the industry quite busy. We had the issue of bid window 5, request for proposals, on the 12th of April 2021. The submission of the proposals on the 16th of August 2021. Sadly, also at that time, Sawia lost their CEO, Ntombifuthi Ntuli, also in August 2021. That position still has not been replaced, and I know the Sawia board are actively looking for a suitable replacement to carry on the profound and amazing work that Ntombi was doing with all the working groups. Then recently, 28th of October, we had the announcement of the bid window 5 preferred bidders, and I'll give a short summary on that just now, as well as the announcement that bid window 6 could be expected in Q1 of 2022, possibly even bid window 7 by the end of 2022. Okay, just a quick summary of the bid window 5 results. So first off, the 13 solar projects. Yeah, basically just what I'm covering here is the number of projects awarded, the winners, and what's quite interesting and relevant is the prices that the winning projects were awarded, and I'll give a little summary of that in the following slide, where we sort of compare the prices from bid window 1 down through to bid window 5. Essentially mainstream with 6 solar projects totaling 450 megawatts, RNG Skatec each winning 3 projects totaling 450 projects between the two of them, 450 megawatts, sorry, and then lastly Total Energies and Melilo with 1 project at 75 megawatts. The lowest price there was 37 cents per kilowatt hour. On the wind side, we had mainstream winning 6 projects with a total of 824 megawatts. The weighted average there was 43 cents across all 6 projects per kilowatt hour. And then we had EDF and Red Rocket each also with 3 projects totaling 784 megawatts. 25 projects in total. Just for everyone's information, the 25 projects will now see out a financial close period, which is anticipated to close at the end of April 2022, and thereafter construction would begin. So if all goes to plan, you would be looking at the rolling out of construction of the 25 projects Q2, Q3 2022. What's interesting to note, I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, is 102 projects were bid. I know this is often raised by the likes of Sabah and BirdLife South Africa, and particularly becomes interesting when we look at cumulative impacts. So 102 projects bid, but ultimately only 25 will be coming into reality over the next 2 to 3 years. Another point, construction period would probably be about 2 years, so you can anticipate those projects coming online around 2024. Moving on to a summary of the entire reprogram to date. So a couple of things I want to highlight here. Firstly, if we can just look at windows 1, 2, 3, and 4, essentially, you can see ran consecutively. 2011, 2012, 13, 14, with either preferred bidders being announced the same year or, in the case of bid window 4, the following year. Then we had that big gap with bid window 4 in 2015 announced, and only bid window 5 opened up this year. The second item I just want to highlight here is, well, yeah, that gives a nice summary of the time frames between also preferred bid announcement and financial close. The second item I want to point out is total number of projects bid versus the number of projects actually awarded. So, in including bid window 5, essentially through the 5 bid windows, 404 projects have been bid and 117 projects have been awarded. So it's quite important to realize that only 25% of the projects, that have been developed and bid are actually turning into actual projects or actually realizing. This becomes quite important when we talk about cumulative impacts. We know that not all projects will make it over the line, but it is, I know, an ongoing point for discussion, and how do we cater for the amount of projects being developed versus those that actually realize into real projects. Yeah, next main thing is really the price or the tariff. So here just showing the decline in both wind and solar. Probably got my colors wrong there, but essentially looking at quite large decreases from bid window 1 to bid window 5, with both wind and solar sort of averaging out at the same area at the moment at around 50 cents per kilowatt hour, with solar starting at R3.29. Why such these drastic these large decreases? Firstly, increased competition. You're essentially bidding to get capacity and sell electricity to Eskom. Eskom has to buy the cheapest electricity. So if you want your piece of the pie, you're going to have to lower your tariffs as much as you can. How else do you lower them? You lower your internal rate of return. So bid window 1, for instance, the IPPs were seeing larger IRRs, around 17%, I believe. Bid window 5, probably closer to the 12-13% IRR range. Reduced technology costs, that just comes with improved efficiencies, improved manufacturing. Also, what we saw in bid window 5 was the cluster approach, so benefiting from economies of scale. So you can build 3 projects adjacent to each other, build out at the same time, economies of scale. And then lastly, which was given in a recent online webinar, this longer term picture. So historically, tariffs were modeled on the 20-year PPA that essentially Eskom would be signing. What the IPPs have started to do is realize that the assets are still capable of producing electricity and selling electricity after the 20-year PPA. So, take a longer term view of profitability that can be made beyond 20 years. And all these things combined allow the tariffs to just be reduced lower and lower. Okay, so where does that put us as a whole? I know we present this also at every BARF update, but a quick recap of the Integrated Resource Plan 2019. So this is now the gazetted numbers. And what I'm going to just show you here, something which we don't often see, is the planned decommissioning on the coal side. Okay, and then the planned new energy or new additional capacity shown in green. So you can see as of 2021, there was around 2,000 megawatts of wind on the grid, 1,500 megawatts of PV, a couple of CSP, and then increasing respectively to just under 18,000 megawatts of wind and just over 8,000 megawatts of PV. And more, well, also interesting enough, you have coal, despite some small additional new capacity, that with the planned decommissioning, we're having a coal reduction in capacity of around 4,000 megawatts, from 37,000 megawatts to 33,000 megawatts. So the situation, in short, essentially, is coal decreasing by approximately 4 gigawatts and renewable energy increasing by 25 gigawatts to 2030. What what consideration factors this means. How do we realize this 25 gigawatts that is needed to be added to the grid? Is number one, grid capacity. There is currently some serious constraint on the Eskom grid, particularly in the Northern Cape, the Western Cape, potentially even, moving Eastern Cape, etc. Land availability. Obviously, any new projects require land, so this needs to be considered. Then I think more of interest for today's session is the environmental constraints. It is well known, and we will hear how the renewable energy, particularly the wind facilities, have large impacts on the likes of bird collisions, bat collisions, barotrauma, as well as other fauna, rabbits, butterflies. There's a number of considerations, and what we really need to do as an industry and as associated industries is figure out how we add this 25 gigawatts in the most sustainable way so that we are aiding in reducing that coal by 4 gigawatts. Bearing in mind, I think that in itself is a positive consideration. With coal coming offline, there should be net benefits to the environment as well. These are the types of discussions that we should possibly be having also as industry associations. But yes, how do we bring on this 25 gigawatts? What measures can we put in place? How do we improve? How do we improve mitigation measures? How do we better develop? How do we, as industries, work together to see this build out? Then also, in addition, there's legislation. Some of you might be aware, others not. A project requires probably around 40 permits before construction can begin, one of which is the environmental authorization. So you need permits from civil aviation, you need permits, you need rezoning, you need Section 53 DMRE permits, the list goes on. Then just added extra, the likes of a square kilometre array, but essentially it is one of the permits you need. You need approval that you're not interfering on that infrastructure, and essentially that the square kilometre array also sterilizes a lot of land. So how do we, again, see out this build of 25 gigawatts taking into account these consideration factors? Okay, moving on to policy developments. So just highlighting some additions or changes since 2019. We obviously have the REDS, the Renewable Energy Development Zones. So we had the REDS 1 and the Power Corridors gazetted in February 2018, just showing those again. The green areas with the orange corridors. What we had this year in February is a further gazetting of 3 additional renewable energy zones. One in Emehleni, one in the northwest, and one near Beaufort West. Just for your information, the northern areas are largely solar renewable energy development zones, and the southern ones wind. The Beaufort West REDS is both a solar and wind renewable energy development zone. Another very important policy development this year was the amendment to Schedule 2 of the Electricity Regulation Act. So essentially, this amendment allowed for license exemptions for the generation and operation of up to 100 megawatts of power from the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, NERSA. Previously, this was 1 megawatt. So essentially, you could produce and use electricity up to 1 megawatt without requiring a license from NERSA. That this year was obviously increased to this 100 megawatt, and what this enables or allows, or the intention, is for intensive energy users such as your mines, steel manufacturing, refrigeration, data centers, etc., that they could procure and use their own production of energy without it requiring a license or without it requiring a public tender process such as REAP. Obviously, this is subject to a couple of conditions. There has to be grid availability, so it would be subject to a grid connection approval from Eskom. Also, the projects would need to be registered with NERSA, just so that NERSA could monitor the production and generation of electricity around the country. These essentially would also need to be in line with the Integrated Resource Plan. What this means for the industry is, whereas historically renewable energy projects were only bid and awarded through the REAP program, what we found this year is private companies are tendering and procuring private capacity, which means renewable energy projects are able to respond to those private tenders, in addition to the REAP program, which to date all the current projects have largely been awarded. Okay, in terms of guideline developments, just going to fix this slide quickly. I'm just going to cover the additional guidelines that have essentially come into play and are relevant to the industry since 2019. So starting off, we have under the bird guidelines, we have the black carrier guidelines, which were published in May 2020 and are now being considered in the development of renewable energy projects. Then earlier this year, we had the updated Verreaux's Eagle guidelines, which were issued for comment and review. So we did participate in commenting on that, to which BirdLife South Africa also responded. I believe, and I will leave this for perhaps Sam or BirdLife SA to correct me later, but I believe we're just awaiting the final published version. Then simultaneously, the birds and wind energy best practice guidelines were also updated and issued for review. So again, we have commented and submitted responses. We'll leave it for BirdLife SA. I believe those are still being finalized. From a SABA perspective, or the South African Bat Assessment Association, we've had 2 updated editions come in. We have the Pre-Construction Guidelines 5th edition that came into effect from the 8th of March 2020, and we've had the BAT Operational Guidelines 2nd edition that have become applicable from June 2020. Okay, I've definitely gone beyond my time allocation, so I'm going to try and flip through the blade painting update as quickly as possible. So blade painting is one of the bird collision mitigation measures that are currently being explored by some of the SWIA members. So motion smear may be one of the causal factors for bird collisions with turbines. Motion smear essentially is the inability of a bird's brain to distinguish a fast-moving object because it is moving too fast for the retina to see it. Essentially, the spinning turbine blades blend in with the background, and the birds struggle to see it, resulting in collisions. So blade painting, or painting of one of the 3 white turbine blades, is a different color, has been proposed as a mitigation to this, so that motion smear is disrupted and the turning blades can be more easily seen. This was proven effective through a research paper at Smaller Island in Norway, and a study which has been published. So where we are as an industry, there's concerns and considerations, the proof of concept. So there's only one published experiment, and that is the smaller experiment. We need to actively get additional experiments in the South African context to see if this is in fact going to be a suitable measure within the South African context. Very different landscapes and environments compared to Norway. Some technical commercial aspects. So the concerns, there are concerns that the paint may raise the temperature of the blade, it may affect blade weighting, it may affect warranties that are given by the turbine suppliers. The considerations, is red an option compared to black? So the discussion with civil aviation is that red is a well-known and well-used color already on blades, so could this not be considered to break the smear? Also, if you're painting one blade, is it possible to then paint the other two just to even out the weight? This obviously comes with additional costs, so that has to be taken into consideration. And warranties. The idea is, if we get it right, and if we prove successful, that this painting could be done during production. So it's not essentially added after the fact, which comes with all sorts of other risks. The cost, it's much higher if it's implemented on turbines already in operation. Could be very much reduced if it's painted in production. Visual impact could be an obstacle, particularly if it needs to be redone as part of the EIA, and CAA permission is required. This is currently probably the main stumbling block at the moment. CAA are not 100% clear how to regulate the painted blade. They have very particular marking standards for aviation. So currently they are rather asking, could the aviation markings not be used as a form of motion smear? So this is still obviously a discussion point with CAA. Where we're at is there are a number of wind farms considering blade painting, as long as the technical considerations are taken into account. So Jeffreys Bay Wind Farm is in the advanced stages and are pretty much ready to paint a few test blades, and are just taking on this application process with CAA currently. Yep, as I mentioned, that CAA seems to be the main hurdle. I think once that is unblocked, that we will start to see more and more of the blade painting put into place, and hopefully we start getting some good results. Let me quickly wrap up. So just an outlook on wind energy in SA. Key optimistic signals. I think this year has been an exceptional year for the industry. Not only was the Bid Window 5 RFP released, projects submitted, and preferred bidders announced, we've also heard that Bid Window 6 and Bid Window 7 are possibly in the pipeline. We obviously still have the IRP in place and gazetted, and with those numbers that are in place for renewable energy. In the IRP, wind is forming a large portion of the energy mix, so that's exciting to see from the industry side. Government appears to be committed to the clean energy transition away from coal. This is getting evidently more clear year by year. And another positive, less anti-renewable rhetoric within Eskom. We're even seeing Eskom, looking into developing their own renewable energy projects. I think the prices that Bid Window 5 came out with, it makes sense for Eskom to purchase renewable energy. Still a couple of challenges though. On the other side, we still have the unbundling of Eskom. Is it going to happen? When's it going to happen? The grid on that matter. Very large constraint. Can we see build out of transmission lines to facilitate the growth of renewable energy? Coal and the socio-economic impact of the transition, it still very much needs to be taken into consideration. Are we able to transition people from coal into renewable energy jobs? The slow rate of economic growth and declining demand. I think COVID also hasn't made things easier there. Competition from other technologies, so embedded generation plus storage. And then lastly, renegotiation of round 1 to 3 tariffs, whether they're in the process, and will those be resolved? I am 8 minutes over. I apologize, and thank you very much for having Sawia.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very, very much for the opportunity to be able to present the department's work to you this morning. And thank you also to BirdLife Africa for the platform. I'm going to talk to you today about the SEA programs, the screening tool, and the specialist assessment protocols that the department has been working on for some time. I'm going to give you a bit of the background, tell you what we've been doing in the last 2 years, and then also explain to you what is in the pipeline for the year or two going forward. So in order to streamline authorizations, the EIA authorization process requirements, and to ensure that we afford the highest levels of environmental protection, the department has been implementing a program of strategic environmental assessments for government priority projects since 2013. This program has led to the conditioning of environmental data into various sensitivity categories for inclusion into the screening tool. The screening tool has been implemented since October 2019, and the objectives of the screening tool, just to recap, is to identify environmental sensitivities of a site related to various environmental themes. Through the SEA program, there was also an initial set of protocols for specialist assessments and the minimum reporting content requirements for specialist reports. Also for specific environmental themes, they were developed and implemented since March 2020. The objectives of the protocols are to provide guidance to the environmental assessment practitioners or the specialists preparing the specialist assessment report by undertaking the assessment using a consistent methodology, providing consistency in information for EIA documents, answering specific questions that are needed by the competent authority when making decisions, and providing a compliance statement option rather than an assessment for areas of confirmed low environmental sensitivity. The past 2 years, we've seen several successes for the screening tool and the protocol implementation, but we've also been aware of frustrations from EAPS, and we've had both positive and negative comments on these tools. So just on a recap on the link between the screening tool and the environmental sensitivity from the screening tool and the protocols. So on the left, you'll see the environmental sensitivity here for the paleontology theme. You've got very high, high, or low. In this case, the site is situated on a paleontology combined sensitivity of very high, and therefore it will then show you that you will be able to touch on the icon for showing the assessment protocol, and the assessment protocol will then come up and it will identify to you what level of assessment you need to do for that specific theme and for the sensitivity that's been highlighted there. The protocols also are identified in the screening tool report alongside the environmental themes. So here you'll see the specialist reports required for this assessment, and then the assessment protocols are linked with a URL to that. So what's new? In October 2020, we added species data to the screening tool. The data gives the actual plant and the animal species names if it's not threatened. If it's threatened, then you would have to call, it gives you a code, and you would have to call SAMBI in order to identify exactly what threatened species you need to be looking for. A second set of protocols were gazetted on the 30th of October 2020, and these related also then to terrestrial flora and fauna themes. And these terrestrial flora and fauna themes are supported by a specialist environmental assessment guideline produced by SAMBI. So whereas the protocol sets out the what, so what information is required, the assessment or the species environmental assessment guideline sets out the how. So it looks at the methodology that you need to be using in order to undertake the assessment. There have been 3 new renewable energy development zones have been added, and these are referred to as the mining renewable energy development zones, and we've also gazetted with that procedures for the EIAs in those areas. That was done in February 2021. Then we've gazetted gas corridors as well as the EIA procedures for gas corridors in those, for gas projects in those corridors, and that was done in May 2021. We've then also done extensions to the strategic transmission corridors, as well as the associated EIA procedures linked to developments within those strategic corridors, and that was done in April 2021. Then in January 2021, the screening tool was updated to accommodate inputs from users and also the inputs from the internal review of the system that we did. And some of the amendments that we made is we added a frequently asked questions to the landing page. So you'll see that on the left-hand side. We added a fine scale option to the zooming in and out. We then fixed some gaps in the cadastre data. We added the agricultural holdings and the public places. And then we added an annotation function to the map generation features. We changed the background color and the sensitivity colors. That was to allow for the footprint to be seen more easily. Then by selecting specific types of cadastre, so for example, a farm cadastre, the result box would only provide matches of that record for that specific type. So that just reduces the number of sites that were possible. The application category, so that's the application category in terms of what you've chosen, is identified on the front page of the report. There are quarterly renewable energy applications now shown on the screening tool, not just provided as data. Then areas greater than 500 square kilometers. The manager of the screening tool has the ability to be able to set these areas larger than 500 square kilometers, and the EP and the specialist would need to just request that service from the screening tool operator. And then we've also done a quarterly update of cadastre data. So what's in the pipeline? We are looking at a terrestrial plant and animal, expanding the terrestrial plant and animal protocols. We're looking at gazetting them for freshwater aquatic species, and that we're expecting to be done in June 2022 for comment. We're looking at the freshwater species data to be added to the screening tool, so that's animals and plants, also by June 2022 to support the protocol. We're looking at countrywide risk mapping for Cape Vultures, and that's a project that's a collaboration between BirdLife, UCT, and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. We're then also going to gazette a Cape Vulture protocol, which would be associated with that risk map, which we would be finalizing for public comment, and we're hoping to have that out by March 2022. We're looking at a heritage protocol being finalized for public comment, and that should be done by June 2022. We're planning a new Karoo SCA looking at electricity grid corridors to connect the central corridor and the northern corridor, as well as providing a Botswana link. We're planning to refine the Beaufort West and the Mpumalanga Renewable Energy Development Zone boundaries, and to assess the Klerksdorp and the Mpumalanga Reds for wind. We will be gazetting the standard for the development of power lines and substations in identified geographical areas for public comment. We did gazette these last year, but through the comments we needed to make some amendments, so we're going to resubmit them for public comment again this year. And those are for areas that are confirmed to be low and medium, and that should be done by March 2022 for comment. And then just to say that the department would really value any inputs on these planned environmental instruments from the community. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thanks so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sam Ralston-Payton. I'm BirdLife South Africa's Birds and Renewable Energy Project Manager. For those of you who do know me, we probably haven't seen each other for quite some time thanks to COVID, and I'm sure, like me, many of you are wishing that the world was not quite as messy and complicated as it is today. And it's not just COVID that's making it a messy, complicated place. We are also in a climate crisis as well as an ecological crisis. This is important for renewable energy because although renewable energy is clean, it's a lot better than something like coal, it's not entirely green. And these environmental impacts are something we need to address urgently, and we need to address together if we are to see the amount of wind power installed in our country without having significant impacts on biodiversity. So just a bit of a roadmap to my presentation. I'm going to be chatting about the resources that BirdLife South Africa and our partners have developed to support the responsible development of renewable energy. I'm going to address some of the key questions and comments that have been raised in response to stakeholder consultation around our guidelines. I'm also going to give you a bit of a take on my perception of some of the challenges and potential solutions to ensure that renewable energy really does develop without harming nature. And then ultimately I'm going to end with a bit of a challenge to the industry with the hope that you're going to come away inspired and determined to find some solutions to the messy problems that we have to deal with. I'm sure I don't need to emphasize the importance of site selection to most of you out there. The location of energy infrastructure is key to minimizing the impacts. Our science and innovation team has developed some really useful habitat suitability models for our threatened species that can be used to support site selection. I'm not going to go into much detail about these because my colleague is going to be chatting about it a bit more in the next session. I'm going to chat a bit about our best practice guidelines. These are our guidelines developed together with the Endangered Wildlife Trust and the Birds and Renewable Energy Specialist Group. And the idea with these guidelines is to provide recommendations for minimum data collection and reporting requirements, with the intention that monitoring and impact assessment is undertaken in an objective, structured and scientific manner. The guidelines have been around for some time now, but it was only really around 2012 that they were widely implemented. Before then, we saw lots of EIAs and lots of environmental authorizations issued, but unfortunately, many of these were based on what we now consider to be inadequate information and have some real environmental challenges associated with them, although many still do hold environmental authorization. 2015, we saw the third edition of the guidelines, and it was not until 2020 that our guidelines were referenced in a piece of legislation issued by the Department of Environment, Fisheries and Forestry, the avifaunal protocol as it's commonly known. So this protocol really outlines the requirements for specialist assessment and report content requirements. And the links to the best practice guidelines are specifically related to the location of the control site and some of the contents of the pre-application monitoring plan. Now, one of the things that we really have learned in South Africa is that monitoring and information sharing really does matter. This beautiful bird here is a black harrier. It's an endangered species. It's got a limited distribution and a really small population. And thanks to monitoring, we now know that this bird is at risk of colliding with wind turbines. We've had fatalities at 4 different wind farms in South Africa now. Fortunately, most of those have just had one fatality, and only one has had multiple fatalities so far. But it's still concerning because some work done by Francisco Cervantes from the University of Cape Town suggests that the addition of just 5 fatalities of adults each year will cause the population to crash in 75 years. But hopefully, thanks to monitoring and prompt information sharing, it's not too late, and we will be able to find some solutions and make sure that wind energy doesn't help drive the species to extinction. Earlier this year, we did release a new edition of the best practice guidelines for stakeholder consultation. We haven't quite finalized it yet, primarily because we are waiting for the finalization of guidelines for post-construction monitoring that are being developed by IFC and EBRD to be finalized, because we want to make sure that we are aligning our recommendations as much as possible. So hopefully this will be done next year. Some of the key proposed changes so far are to align the terminology and recommendations with various guidelines developed by SAMBI, as well as the DFFE's various protocols. I don't have time to go into all the changes, but we're also trying to address some of the key challenges that have been noted through our Birds and Renewable Energy Specialist Group. So one of those are the need to strengthen environmental management outcomes and actions that are included in the environmental management program, so that there's less uncertainty what happens once a wind farm is operational. To complement the best practice guidelines, we have a series of species guidelines. We've got guidelines for Faroe's eagle, Cape Vulture, Black Harrier, and we've just recently finalized the text for the Faroe's eagle second edition guidelines. If anybody wants a copy of that, please do let me know. So why did we produce these species guidelines? Well, primarily, we noted that there was inconsistent monitoring methodology and recommendations by specialists, and we wanted to see, well, what does the science say? So the guidelines provide advice on how to not only assess, but also to avoid and mitigate impacts. They are authored by species experts, as well as informed by extensive consultation with stakeholders. They are based on the best available evidence and expert opinion at the time, and they also do identify a list of research priorities to address key knowledge gaps. Essentially, the guidelines are BirdLife South Africa's input into EIA processes. Well, one of the key questions, comments that gets raised is around the legal status of the guidelines, and we need to be clear that guidelines cannot be a legal instrument. They are guidelines. Furthermore, BirdLife South Africa is an NGO. We cannot create legislation, or we cannot make decisions, but we can seek to influence them. The protocol, the avifauna protocol, does refer to specific aspects of the best practice guidelines, but at this stage, there's no reference to the species guidelines themselves. Next questions around whether there's scope for specialist or discretion by the environmental assessment practitioner. And absolutely, there is. Impact assessment should always be based on the best available information. I think key is that the opinions should always be evidence-based and clearly justified. And even the avifauna protocol allows for deviations, provided that they are well motivated. Ultimately, it's up to the competent authority to apply their discretion. We also get asked about why we emphasize avoidance. And this is because we are looking at tools such as the mitigation hierarchy, which is embedded in the National Environmental Management Act, and it's also something that's promoted by international financial institutions in their environmental policies and safeguards. Avoidance is really the most risk-averse and precautionary approach, and once you start looking at other steps down the line, for example, minimization or offset, you tend to have fewer options to achieve no net loss or a net gain of biodiversity. And you also have increasing costs, risks, delay, uncertainty, and increasing risk of failure. Luckily, we have plenty of alternatives. We have alternative locations in South Africa, and we also have alternative technologies available for us to meet our renewable energy targets without compromising nature. Next question is, well, do we have enough evidence? This is specifically related to our species environmental assessment guidelines. And sometimes our evidence is limited, and could certainly be strengthened. But the truth is that impact assessments and environmental authorizations are being issued regardless of NEMA. The National Environmental Management Act does call for a risk-averse and cautious approach. And what we've tried to do in our guidelines is draw on the available information to see, well, how can we reduce the amount of time for data collection and research to address those uncertainties, but still make sure that we are being precautionary enough. Sometimes it is beyond the scope of an EIA to address those knowledge gaps, and I think a key discussion is how we as a community can start doing that. Another question is about what about all the other aspects of sustainable development? Birds and biodiversity are just one issue that needs to be considered. And we don't claim to try to do that in our guidelines. The protocols, the avifauna protocol and the guidelines are intended to inform avifaunal specialist assessment, and consideration and integration of all those other aspects should take place within the EIA process. So are we on the right track in South Africa with renewable energy development? Well, there certainly are a number of challenges, and I've just noted a couple here. But there are also some solutions. One of the challenges I think in South Africa is that we have a really competitive industry, which is fantastic in terms of driving prices down. But we do have more projects that are proposed and are required to meet our energy targets. And this makes addressing cumulative impacts really tricky. So the solution is that I think we need much stronger spatial planning, and this needs to extend beyond just identifying nodes where renewable energy development is desirable, but also start addressing the questions of how do we mitigate those impacts in those development nodes. Chatted a bit about the gaps in available evidence, and to some extent some of those gaps can be addressed in the EIA process, but some of them are much more strategic, and we don't want to sit with a situation where we have a deadlock, where we rely on the precautionary approach and we don't ever move forward and address those knowledge gaps. How do we do that? Well, I think we need a well-funded and well-supported research program, and there we need buy-in and support from government and industry and NGOs to identify and address those strategic research and knowledge gaps. There's a big time gap between EIA, the assessment of impacts and construction, and during the time, the receiving environment, technology, and mitigation options can all change. So we often sit with these outdated environmental authorizations and EMPRs. How do we address that? Well, a little bit of a controversial one, but we could limit the validity period of EIAs so that they are only valid for a limited period of time. But perhaps a more palatable one is that we need to revisit those authorizations and assessments, including with new data, before they are renewed. But at some point, we do need to take stock of all the existing environmental authorizations, and perhaps it will be appropriate to take some of those out of the system. Although we are accused of focusing only on avoidance, we do acknowledge that operational phase impacts are likely to occur and they do need to be mitigated. Unfortunately, what we're finding is that operational phase mitigation is not happening at many sites, and it can take many, many years and lots of discussions before it happens. So what we are proposing is that environmental management programs are what's known as SMART, so they're much more specific, measurable, and time-bound. Because we can't afford to be waiting 5-10 years before a site actually does anything to address significant impacts. We also need rigorous environmental audits, and at some point we are going to have more to oversight and enforcement of operational phase mitigation. And I think we're doing really, really well in South Africa in terms of transparency and information sharing, but we can always do better. And I think that will do a lot in terms of making sure operational phase impacts are addressed, but also help address knowledge gaps and assessment of cumulative impact. Are we on the right track? I'll ask that again. I think industry is already doing a lot for the environment, but I think we can do more. We need to start thinking beyond these discussions about what is acceptable impacts and start thinking about how can industry really contribute to improving the receiving environment in which they are located. Industries are often well placed to be environmental stewards. We've seen with other industries, for example, the wine industry. And there are plenty of opportunities for landowners together with developers to reduce other threats to biodiversity. I've just listed a couple there. I don't have time to go into it, but I am really hoping that that's something that we're going to discuss more tomorrow. So just to end off with, I'd like to challenge industry to think beyond what's the bare minimum they need to do to get away with development, and start looking at synergies between conservation, development, and the SED, social economic development requirements. I believe that together with the landowner, wind farms could contribute to conservation. At the very least, they could help address some of the cumulative impact. And ultimately, you could begin to maximize the benefit of investment in climate change action. We can't afford to be just looking at things in silos anymore. So thank you very much. I appreciate the time, and I also appreciate the contribution of all my colleagues who've contributed to various discussions and tools that we've developed, and ultimately also to Investec, who's been sponsoring BirdLife South Africa's work on renewable energy. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody, and a very big thank you for inviting Sabah to be part of the BARF 2021. It's good to be here, and it's good to listen to what you guys are doing as well. 2021 has been a very strange year. It's been part lockdown paralysis, and people have not been available for meetings and so on, and it's been part incredibly busy, which is actually incredibly good, but also very challenging to deal with. So what are we working on? We're working on some minor changes to the pre-construction guidelines. It won't change things very much. We're looking at new solar and other large development guidelines. We're working, the big one, on cumulative impacts of wind energy farms at a larger scale. And we're looking at formalizing training of operational monitoring searchers. And then one big question which I'd like to discuss with you guys, because it's going to need the bird people on board if we can get this working. So what are we doing to pre-construction guidelines? We're doing some minor tweaks, and the one that's under discussion at the moment is driving transects may be removed or may be optional. For those of you that don't know what driving transects are, this is where you put a bat detector on outside your car, or just the microphone outside your car, and at dusk you drive slowly around the area to survey it, and at the end of that you can tell which areas have got the large number of bats out and hunting at dusk. That works very well in some cases, not well in others. It's not popular with the specialists, and I do understand that, because if you've got it for that particular date and that particular night is incredibly windy or incredibly rainy, the bats just aren't going to be out and hunting, so it's not going to show you anything. A good specialist, a skilled specialist, an experienced specialist actually doesn't need a driven transect. They can look at an area and go, yeah, well, the bats will be there hunting over the wetland, along the forest edge, riverine areas, etc. There may be occasions when a driven transect is still important though, so that is under discussion. There are a few minor tweaks for pre-construction as well. For example, the specialists mostly use SM4 detectors, wildlife acoustic detectors. They have changed from the SM2s, but in doing that change, they've also changed the parameters for measuring bat calls. And there's a bit of discussion as to how we can change that, and it's going to have to get written into the guidelines. Currently, we've got no general guidelines to allow specialists to
certainly a list of guidelines as to what triggers a bat assessment, but what we find is if they get called in to, for example, survey an area for a solar PV farm, some specialists will say, yes, well, we'll put up static detectors, we'll work on it for a year. Some specialists go, yeah, we'll look at it in Google Earth. And that's not fair in the developers. The developers have to know upfront just how much input they're going to need. And so we'd like to put out guidelines for that. Cumulative impacts is a big one. Bats have got one of the lowest fecundity rates for animals of their size. They have one pup a year, sometimes only one pup every 2 years. Occasionally twins, but it's not common. And so decimated populations do not easily recover. So it's important we don't lose the bats and then just go, well, maybe they'll grow back. There are some areas in the country where bat numbers are naturally high. The concomitant death rate for wind farms in those areas are high, and I'm talking specifically about the Eastern Cape, Southern Eastern Cape. There's a lot of wind farms already with high death rates there. There's more wind farms planned in those areas. It is going to have an impact on population levels of bats at a provincial scale. It's going to have impacts on agriculture and the environment. We just need to find a way to measure that and to actually put it out there. Fairly recent work from one of the bat people. We could lose up to 1 million bats in the next 25 years, just on where the wind farms are at the moment. That's going to have an impact on ecosystem services. So we need to discuss how to determine cumulative impacts, but for starters, we can't even get operational reports from quite a few wind farms. Some of them, and if you guys are out there, yes, they're great. But most of them are not sending reports through to Sabah, so it's difficult to actually work out how many bats are being killed. We're well aware that some wind farms are not running adequate searcher trials. Some of them were built before there was a request that they put that into the management plan. Some of them are just ducking and diving. So who's responsible for checking that wind farms are monitoring correctly? I guess that's the department people. But we need to check. And why don't we get reports? We have to ask other people for reports, and a very big thank you to those other people that send me reports. Another cumulative death rate problem, that is an Egyptian free-tail bat. If you look at the current bat books, you will find the Egyptian free-tail bat is widespread and least concern. However, we are well aware, and we have been aware for about 4 years, that there is a cryptic species there. There are 2 species of Egyptian free-tail bats in South Africa. And one of them is smaller, more gracile, one of them is larger, heavier. Just from briefly looking at the wind farm bats that I have seen, it looks like it's the smaller gracile form that is being wiped out. And that could be a very big problem. Unfortunately, as I say, we've known for 4 years because the student doing her PhD on this still has not finished her PhD. And if anybody's got any bright ideas how to force a student to finish a PhD, I'm all ears. Otherwise, we're going to have to take it over next year and do it ourselves, because we need to know where those guys are. How do we identify them? What's their distribution in South Africa? And just what is their death rate compared to the total population? Because there is a chance that it's very high. Training of searchers. I have seen this mentioned in many places and everybody keeps talking about it and we're not actually doing anything about it. We'd like to formalize the training of searchers with a standardized training manual, a formal test, certificate awarded. This would allow us to teach the searchers more about the environment, more about bats, why are we doing these searches, what is renewable energy, etc. It could also be expanded, of course, to include first aid, basic business training and so on. It's going to need buy-in from developers, SOEA, etc. It is going to cost, obviously. And I don't think this is going to come from the developers and the operators of the wind farms. It's going to have to come from the department or SOEA. Putting it out there. I'm happy to get involved, to talk about it, to do anything that's needed. And then one of my very big questions. The Motus wildlife tracking system is a large-scale monitoring system. You simply put up towers and then you put transmitters on your animals, and they can be anything. They can be birds, little birds, big birds, bats, insects, anything that's flying around, or anything that's wandering in the ground as well, actually. And And then we can use these towers to track things like, where do our bats migrate from and to? Currently, we know some of our bats migrate, but honestly, we don't know much about them. We could do home range sizes of bats, of our largest raptors, etc., etc. However, this is one big expensive system. It could be split up. For example, if we asked each wind farm to put up one tower, we could actually track bats moving and bats, and especially large birds, moving across those landscapes, which would be great. So putting it out there, we need money for it. And that, I think, is all I have to say today. I think I'm probably out of time. So, yeah, a very big thank you, everybody, for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christy. Some of my background, I've worked as a River Run Rabbit program manager for a few years at the Endangered Wildlife Trust. Worked as a River Run Rabbit and faunal specialist, as an EIA specialist for years. I've worked in community development, advocacy, and climate change adaptation, amongst other things. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little about what's needed for sustainable renewable energy. Please remember, sustainable is not refer only to environmental sustainability. It's also economic and social sustainability. But I'm not going to go into huge detail on the issues with the EIA process. We all know those. Life's not perfect. Today, I'm going to discuss some of the greater context and opportunities that we might be used going forward. A while ago, I was flying over to the Karoo National Park, and I looked out of my window and I saw a wind farm, and I got quite a shock because it reminded me very intensely of those photos of fracking in the United States. Those aerial photos of fracking. And while I know wind farms aren't going to be drilling deep for aquifers, they are still going to be accumulating quite substantially across the Karoo, and the cumulative impacts are very misunderstood in the world at the moment. So we know this is a little illustration to illustrate the greater context of the renewable energy industry. And we know that one wind farm has habitat loss impacts, has road issues such as roadkill, and increases access by humans to the site, and has noise pollution. And noise pollution is something that we do not explore in enough depth. It's shown in a scientific theory called the landscape of fear that animals avoid high risky areas due to predation risk, or even just perceived predation risk. And often a loud intermittent noise can be construed by animals as perceived predation risk. We do not know if they're habituated, how long it takes them to habituate. We know in marine ecosystems, for example, can result in cascading trophic impacts. So now, the processes are not very well understood. So that's the pattern. The processes are a little bit less studied because they require time and resources, and EIA specialists do not have time. Processes such as predator-prey interactions, dispersal, competition, erosion, foraging behavior all accumulate, and we do not know how these operate at a bigger level. Obviously, the global context is that climate change is biting at our heels, so we need more renewable energy. We do need it. We can't look at it and say we don't want it. But it has to be done in a just transition. That's been shown to be of critical importance. And just transition means that everybody has to be at the table right from the start. You can't bring people halfway in through the process because then they haven't learned the lessons as everybody else, and then they haven't given and taken and haven't been involved in negotiations. It always ends up scuppering the process. So what we don't want to do is repeat the same mistakes of the fossil fuel industry, which also started accumulating rapidly. And that means we still need to look at the full life cycle externalities, such as waste, for example, in solar farms is a big problem that we need to be monitoring. We need to look at the cumulative impact, as I said, and we need to think about things that we're not predicting at the moment, like land use change, where perhaps farmers who are getting money from wind farm royalties or whatever the case might be, aren't going to manage their filters intensively because they don't depend on it so much anymore. So my idea here, my approach was not to give a framework, although I love that word framework, but or policy or plan or anything like that. It's just an approach. That's a process. And humans don't like processes. They like outcomes. They want to plan and control for outcomes. But this is something that needs to be done step by step, baby steps with everybody at the table. So this is the summary of the leverage points of the EIA system. Just for today, we're going to discuss the EIA system. And some of these leverage points are traditional access points, but some of them can be unlocked using people or tools that have worked before or other such aspects. So we'll start with screening. This has been done very well in the past. South Africa is very good at making CBA maps, protected area maps, lovely pattern maps, I call them. But unfortunately, pattern maps don't always give you the answer, especially around processes which are temporal, have a temporal attribute. So if you wanted a process map, you'd have to do several pattern maps to see how the processes change the pattern. Obviously, we don't have the resources for this. So also the problem with existing screening tools, they are a bit cumbersome and unwieldy to use, even for somebody such as me who has worked in with GIS and various tools for a long time in the past. People don't want to use things that are not easily usable, or they just give it to somebody else like a specialist to do. Developers, we don't engage them enough. They are people. We need to build, EIA specialists often build really good working relationships with developers, and relationships are built on trust and liking, and we need to start leveraging those opportunities to talk to each other more about what's needed in our individual worlds. Specialists. Okay, so specialists, a lot relies on specialists, I've learned. Specialists can often make or break a project, and they're the ones who can say if something's no-go. But how do they use, what data do they use to do that? And I think a good specialist is often good because they've been in the field and are a natural historian, so to speak. And they base decisions based on comparative measures, relative conditions, because they don't have a benchmark. There's no reference condition in the felt at the moment. We've really screwed up so much stuff. So specialists they look at aspects by looking at one site in their mind and comparing it relative to, holding it in place and comparing it relative to all the other sites they've visited. For example, they do not have the information such as this particular site might have 0.2% riverine habitat, so which means loss of it would result in a 2% population decline in the rabbit or something like that. We just don't have that information. But specialists can undergo training by experts. So that's something I want you to bear in mind. That's the key there. Interested and affected parties, or the public participation process, that's a leverage point. Now, the public participation process is not a very good leverage point. I speak from experience. I worked in the fracking public participation process, and it's just the Department of Minerals and Energy just said, noted, 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 noted. So it wasn't meaningful engagement at all. But interested and affected parties, like such a civil society, have a power that they need to use wisely, not to control, not to keep data hidden, but to actually share and use their power exceptionally proactively. So developers aren't going to build a farm where there's an EWT, for example, says they don't like it. So rather than dealing with each individual wind farm case, which is impossible, I know, because there are very few specialists in the Karoo, and especially around riverine rabbits, and now people are building wind farms without using specialists. And who's supposed to be monitoring that? So I would suggest we develop guidelines, such as BirdLife has done so successfully with Sam, and use those guidelines to rather say, if the developer in the Karoo doesn't follow these guidelines, then we're going to oppose them. And make sure your guidelines include everybody's take on the situation. So guidelines cannot be developed by one civil society agent alone. They have to be developed by all parties at the table, because otherwise it represents a conflict of interest. We have to get everybody's measures. So what one civil society agency decides it means is not necessarily what an EIA specialist needs. It's not necessarily what a developer needs. So the studies required need everybody's input at the table. The rabbit, at risk of sounding like a bunny hugger, the rabbit is very important, still as an indicator. Now, I know we'd love to get all the other species and they'd all love to jump on the bandwagon, but I think we need to look at the bigger picture. I think the riverine rabbit can act as a rather clever indicator of resilience. So key resilience areas, as I like to call them, which are those suite of characteristics that the Karoo needs to maintain its basic productivity and ecosystem function under the impacts of climate change. And those are the riverine areas. So the rabbit is still associated in Nama Karoo with riverine conditions, but in the southern Karoo, it's not as much. So, but we can still find commonalities, I think, where those areas of productivity and resilience, as the rabbit has been shown to be quite resilient at the moment, we can find those areas and rather focus on those and protecting those areas that produce productivity and resilience and diversity in the landscape. Then monitoring and evaluation is a very powerful one. And again, it needs everybody at the table, because all the studies are not what the environmentalists only need. We need studies that look at the cumulative impact, for example. We need studies that look at how noise affects the key resilience areas species or endangered species. So we need a variety of things, and that requires resources. So renewable energy is in this industry, it makes money, but how that money is distributed and allocated needs to be done in conjunction with the independent committee, with everybody represented at the table, so that there's no conflict of interest. Again, it's a case of balance, and I like to think of advocacy as being a very, very important part of the whole process, because advocacy is lobbying, but not necessarily in an emotional way. Scientists immediately look at advocacy and say, no, 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 I can't do that. I won't be a scientist anymore. But advocacy is a manner of convincing people, persuading people to understand your viewpoint. I like to call it ignorance busting engagement rather than awareness raising. It's like understanding other people's perspective and bringing your own perspective and finding that compromise. You cannot do it alone. You have to do it with multiple brains, because the solutions are not going to be as obvious as we like to think they are. So this brings us to my approach, which is about guidelines for the Karoo around critical resource areas or key resilience areas, and making the rabbit as an indicator because it's nicely widely distributed and it's quite resilient. And training, here's where the specialists come involved. We can develop training that the guidelines say you need to follow, that all developers need to have the EIA specialists trained before they work in the Karoo. And then we can, hammer out what those things need to look like. Resources, well, if you have everybody at the table, then you've got access to lots of different resources, not only funding, but also time and expertise. And facilitation, this is a process. People have to treat it as a process, and this means taking one step at a time, such as Sam has done so successfully with the renewable energy guidelines for birds and bats. And it means you need an experienced facilitator who brings all people to the table and gives an equal voice. And it needs to be cooperative. And now I know government likes to shy away from cooperative governance because it thinks a loss of power. But you can reframe your mandates, reframe it to make it sure that you can actually do this. Stop thinking along those same neural pathways that we keep doing. We're thinking this is the way, it must be the way, this is the answer, this is the problem. And start branching out and thinking of things in a different way. It's called disrupting, which is not necessarily a negative process. So if you're interested, I think this forum is a great place to start such a venture. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them later. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to all of the speakers. What a wealth of information and insights and questions for consideration by a range of stakeholders. So we do have roughly 15 minutes allocated for a Q&A. If I could just ask all of the speakers from the session who are online to put their cameras on so that we can all see who's here. And I'm going to jump into some of the questions that have been typed up in the Q&A box. I see some of you have already been active in answering questions online, but we'll get through as many of these as we can. So I think first of all, a question directed at Sawia. And here, Cape Vulture asks to please explain in a bit more detail why the CAA is not convinced regarding the painted blades and what effect painted blades would have on aviation.
Good, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thanks, Rebecca.
Great. That is not a very quick answer. So the Environmental Working Group actually does have a subcommittee working specifically on the blade paintings, which is actually being led by another panelist, Libby. So Libby, you have free rein to jump in wherever I may have missed something. But okay, firstly, CAA is bound by their Civil Aviation Act. Okay, and that is essentially their Bible. The members we presented to at CAA were obviously on the sort of higher end or in the more sort of directorate level of CAA. And their sort of first stance was, our first responsibility is the safety of our mechanical birds, as they called them, which I think was quite entertaining in the meeting itself. But and what they said there is, what we can't see in the Act currently is room for one black paint. They obviously do have in some of their SA CATS documents, they stipulate various colors that can be painted on obstacles as well as turbines. So what they said to us is, they said, what you're essentially asking us is to change our acts and our standards. For instance, the SA CAT docs, the technical specification docs. And they said, we feel that, is it not a first step to apply what you can in terms of what you can do in terms of the Act? So, for instance, there is an authorized and an approved red aviation paint. And, you know, could that not be used to first trial and see if that has any effect on reducing collisions or increasing or reducing motion smear, etc. The argument there is particularly that, well, the question back then was, can we do it on one blade? And which, again, the answer was a little bit unclear at the time. They seem to say the aviation painting is quite specific. It's either the bands, either a 2 or 1 band, either like a third in on all 3 blades. So already they weren't certain how to answer if we could paint one blade, you know, 3/4 red. Black was really not in consideration. It's not in their documentation. And they basically said at that point, test what you can within the scope of the Act, or take it higher and ask for policy changes. Then the last sort of avenue they did give us was an exemption, and the exemption was more a 180-day exemption, which, you know, for these sort of investigations, what value do we feel we're getting out of 180 days? But again, the question we're asking internally at the moment is, perhaps this could be a starting point. Why not get a blade up for 180 days and whatever, on 179, day 179, ask for an extension? At least try and, you know, break the mold. I think that's where we are at the moment. We felt very restricted by CAA in their willingness to come to the table. They did mention getting involved with their environmental department, because I think they see it as an environmental issue, but because it's about birds and collisions. But what we're fundamentally saying is, we know it's an environmental issue, but we need to get beyond the legislation. And that's where we're at. So we've had a couple of internal discussions, and I think we're probably going to head in the direction of testing some of the realms we can work within the actual regulations, maybe putting up a test blade for 180 days, or seeing to what extent, getting someone to really deep dive into the regs and give us some advice of how to get the program up and running. There are several wind farms currently very eager, very ready to get the trial underway. So I'm going to end there and give maybe Libby anything she might want to add on that. But I hope that gives a little bit of insight into where we are with the CAA negotiations at the moment.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Yes, so Libby, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Rebecca. Just to say, let me put on my video. I think that just to add to Rebecca's quickly, just to say that I think we're going to try and push it because you know, as you mentioned, so Molilo and Globalec are really keen to take this forward, and what Molilo is wanting to do is actually do a legal review on behalf of the industry and actually see, does the CA actually have a right to stop us from actually painting these blades, given that actually it would be additional mitigation for their mechanical birds as opposed to reduced mitigation. So we're heading in that direction, just to say. In terms of the SAWIA subcommittee, we're incredibly supportive of trying to take this forward as quickly as possible.
Thanks for those responses and definitely for your efforts in that regard. It really is fascinating to hear how of the unintended hurdles that those regulations are presenting. So to DFFE, Dr. Fisher, there are a few questions that popped up during your presentation. So one from Jasper Dick says that there seems to be some confusion about whether turbines can be placed in a medium sensitive zone, e.g. Vera model medium outputs, if they have mitigation measures in place, such as painted blades or shutdown on demand, or whether they're not permitted in medium sensitive zones at all. I see Sam's raised her hand. So Sam, were you wanting a bite of that answer?
Yeah, I think that's relating to our Vero's Eagle guidelines, not so much DFFE's protocols. I think I'm a better position to answer that. The answer is pretty much it depends on the applicant and their willingness to dedicate resources to an additional year of monitoring. If they want to keep things short and sweet and have a quick process, then they should be avoiding medium sensitivity areas. But if they're prepared to dedicate some additional resources to monitoring for a year or for 2 years, then you're going to have more information to make a better informed decision, and then we can start looking at other mitigation options in those areas.
Great, thanks, Sam. And there is a question from Jonathan Aronson regarding bats and whether they fall under the general faunal assessments or whether there's a specific assessment protocol as there is for birds. Dr. Fisher, would you like to comment on this? I know there's no bat-specific protocol, but are there any intentions for the development of such a protocol along the way?
Thank you. Yes, there is no bat protocol currently. We did try to prepare a protocol, but we haven't finalized that yet. So it's not one that's coming up shortly, no.
Thanks very much. And then there's a question from Natalie Baker regarding whether a maximum number of wind farms for each of the reds has yet been determined, and if so, what the preferred distances between each farm. I'm not so sure who feels best positioned to answer this. Sam?
I think Dee's in a better position to answer that than me.
I'm going to point it to Dee as well, if that's okay.
Thank you. We did look at some distances in one of the SCAs that we did, one of the initial SCAs we did, but I think it was just really based on distance. It was just based on a distance between turbines from farm to farm. I think a more appropriate way of doing it would be to look at the wake effect on different farms. So we haven't looked at a finite number. Obviously, your visual impact is going to increase at the more farms you do put on a specific area. So I think the general impact and the cumulative impact that needs to be considered through the EIA process would help to actually determine that. I think it's a difficult thing to just apply distance to. You need to apply, I think, some science and some a visual assessment to what is then the maximum in an area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So keeping with the reds, Sam, there's a question for you about just BirdLife South Africa's opinion on the gazetted reds and their locations. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, yeah. So BirdLife South Africa has made no bones about the fact that we have serious concerns with some of the reds, particularly the reds in the Eastern Cape that include areas that are really important for Cape vultures. I think the REDS SEA process was a really important, useful first step. It's a really good screening exercise, but I don't think it went far enough. So it could be that those REDS are the most strategically important areas to develop renewable energy in South Africa. I think I'm not quite convinced yet. I think a lot more work needs to be done to demonstrate that. But say it was, then I would have liked to see that process go further and say, okay, so these areas are important for development, but we are likely to have significant, and I mean really significant, impacts on threatened species in those areas. And what are we going to do about it? It's not enough to just say these are areas that we want to develop. We actually need and that's what I was talking about earlier, about much stronger spatial planning, including a strategy to mitigate or compensate for impacts.
Thanks very much, Sam. Going back to Sawia, there's a question from Christy Bragg asking, how does the deal between the UK and South Africa to reduce reliance on coal influence the future of renewable energy? Do you think it's likely that the IRP will be revised? I'm sorry, I see Kate also has a hand up. Was that to add to Sam's answer to the previous question?
It was just a tiny little point. I'm seeing some very, very scared people about the Mpumalanga reds, because that's a very important area for bats, and yeah, that could be a bad idea.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, Rebecca, yes, the question about the UK South Africa deal, would you like to comment on that?
Sure, sorry, I was listening to Kate there. Would you just repeat the question about the COP SA and UK deal?
Yes, so the question is...
And transitioning away from coal.
Yes, what influence do you think it will have on the future of renewable energy in South Africa? Do you think it's likely that the IRP will be revised in response to this?
Good question. I'm obviously not closely related or tied to the revisions of the IRP. My understanding is that relationship and any funds made available will be one very crucial, firstly, for the much needed enhancement on the Eskom grid itself, because before any other form of energy, be it renewable energy, be it hydro, anything else that's in the IRP, even the additional coal, nuclear, is the grid needs to be stabilized first, and the grid needs to be able to evacuate the energy to various parts of the country. So in short, I think it will, if it can alleviate the grid, it will then definitely open up for more renewable energy. I don't believe we'll see much of a change to the IRP between now and 2030. I think those numbers are pretty solidified. It will take, it is going to take a good few years before the grid is stabilized. And then hopefully beyond 2030, the numbers we see now in terms of the IRP, I would anticipate we'll start to see a greater move from coal into more renewable energy technologies. There'll always be the baseload arguments and secure generation. And you'll often see in the media a lot of the energy specialists like Chris Yelland, the likes, Finer Green, always talking about the correct energy mix so that the system operates at the best capacity and sustainably. But yeah, in short, I think the funds should be directed to relieving the grid, and in which case, yes, I think we'd move more towards a greater transition into and allowing a greater transition for renewable energy. It also ties in what I said about the 100 megawatt cap policy. You know, with all that being available, and if the tariffs stay as they are and renewable energy is constantly cheaper than coal, I think you'll find the move from private sectors also to renewable energy. But again, it's going to come down to the grid and how we resolve that issue.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. So Kate, there's a follow-up question to one that I see you'd already answered online about roosting sites for bats and their inclusion in the screening tool. And the question is that a mapping of roosts would be useful when commenting on applications to be able to check if a development is near a major, a known major roost. And it asks whether SABAR perhaps has has information of this nature that it would be prepared to share, at least with provincial conservation authorities under data sharing agreements.
Yeah, we've already shared that. We've shared that with the CSIR, and we've shared that. So the major roosts that we know about, although I'm still finding a lot that have been known in the past, and we need to send people out to check whether they're still there. But SABAR is completely unfunded, so we don't actually have anybody to go and get in a truck and go and look, which is always a problem. Yeah.
Thanks very much. So the last question I'll ask, just in the interest of moving on to the next session, is a question looping back to blade painting, and it asks with regards to technical considerations on blade painting, is maintenance of the blade considered, or painting not individual inspections either by a drone, etc., and whether the existing study has mentioned anything in that regard. So, yeah, Rebecca or Libby, I'm not sure if you have a comment on that.
I'll start, and again, Libby can just add anything I've missed or correct anything I may have got incorrect. So technical aspects have been a big consideration also in the blade painting. Probably also one of the earlier challenges we found. So we've got the CAA we've spoken about, and we have the blade manufacturers, well, maybe more than two, but essentially concerns pre-manufacturing and concerns, you know, on operational assets. So on an operational asset, if you're going to go and paint a blade black, number one, you instantly increase the weight on that one blade. So you have to essentially paint the other two blades, even if it's with another coat of white. So you start getting costs. The black blade also absorbs what would you call it, your rays, and increases degradation on that blade, particularly more than the other two blades. Again, it heats up quicker as well. So we found in discussions with the turbine manufacturers and blade suppliers is that there is concern about the warranty that they can give to the blade, and particularly those are post operational, sort of retrospectively painting the blade black. Couple before I move. Okay, then our understanding is it would be much preferable if the painting could be done prior to construction or during manufacturing of the blades, because then they can literally do that during the production process. It's drastically cheaper than having to come and rig people up out on the blades, you know, after the fact, transport them there to and from site. If you're doing it within the factory, it's you know, it's just standard. You apply the paint to whatever automated system is putting it on. And in that case, they also have a lot more control over the warranties and what they're willing to guarantee and warranty, etc. I'm just trying to think if I've missed anything other from a technical aspect. So it's really about the weight of the blades and the degradation. But in short, our understanding with the turbine suppliers is that it is something we can definitely work with them on. And I think Globalec, Jeffreys Bay plant and Malilo, for instance, have also had those discussions, or at a point that the turbine suppliers are willing to take on those associated risks or extra challenges.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay, I'm now going to move on to the next session. There are a few additional questions in the question box, which I'd encourage our speakers to have a look at, in case there are any that you could give a quick answer to in writing. But moving on to the next session today, this is going to focus on the various spatial tools that are available to support developers in their site selection. So we're going to have 3 presentations again, back to back. The first by Ernst Retief from BirdLife South Africa, who's going to be looking at habitat suitability models for threatened baby fauna. Then by Dr. Oliver Cohen from EWT, focusing on the EWT's threatened species no-go map. And then finally from Dr. Francisco Cervantes, looking at the risk map for Cape Vulture. And I should just point out, unfortunately, neither Ernst nor Oliver were able to join us today, but Sam will have a stab at answering any questions that anyone may have, emanating from Ernst's presentation. And we're happy to be joined today by Dr. Ian Little, who will be able to respond to questions regarding Oliver's presentation. And again, this will be followed by a question and answer session. Please do include your answers in the Q&A box. Thank you very much. Karoo, if you can run the next set of presentations, please.
Hi everyone, welcome to this introductory talk about the habitat suitability models that we are developing at BirdLife South Africa. The aim of this talk is to give you a very short overview of the models that we are developing and how it might be of use to you. So just as introduction, we've decided to use the term habitat suitability models purely from a practical point of view. Some people might call it species distribution models. But our aim is actually to show the suitable habitat for a specific species within the boundaries of South Africa. And as indicated there, habitat suitability models make use of computer algorithms to predict the distribution of a species using various environmental data such as temperature, land cover, slope, and soil types. So this is a growing field, becoming more popular. And the models and the technology and layers available to develop these models have improved tremendously during the last number of years. And we want to use these improvements and these new developments to develop high quality distribution models or suitability models for birds in South Africa. How were these models developed? So our idea is to predict suitable habitat by considering biology and habitat used by each species. So we could potentially run models in one large batch using the same sort of bioclim layers and like temperature, altitude, and so on. But during the years, we've learned that it's important to have specific layers for specific species. So for instance, that you add cliffs or slope for vultures, water for water birds, and something like NDVI layers for a species, a grassland species like Boertles lark. So when you run these models, we apply specific layers for each species, and that makes them much more accurate. So we're trying our best to make these models as accurate as possible by developing all these additional layers that feed into the models. There are limitations to these models, and that's important to understand. It's only predictive models. They just suggest where the species could be, and although accurate and we are improving them, it must be understood that it's still models and that it must be analyzed and used, knowing that. So we developed these models in Maxent, the standard software. So we also trying out other software, but so far Maxent is actually doing quite well. We refine these models using GIS software. In our case, we use RPro. So we remove background noise, look at over prediction, removing unnatural areas, using different land cover types and layers. We've gone to great lengths to make sure that the sample data that we use for these models are accurate. So we've used point count data from various postgraduate studies, from specialist groups or government ornithologists. We've made a lot of use of data from the BirdClasser mobile app. I hope you all know about the BirdLife app, that where atlases can record bird distribution data, so we can get the data, the point data for threatened bird species, and use that after we've vetted it into these models. So we vet all these models, and it takes a long time for each species to make sure that all the points that feeds into these models are accurately vetted. For example, one of the things we do with the sample data, so on the left-hand top is the raw data from BirdLife. So you can see there's a lot of data around roads, but we can't use the data as is. It will overestimate the species distribution in that specific range. So we verify these points using a grid system, and we also move them to suitable habitat if an atlas locked the bird on the road and so on. So we're actually doing a lot of effort to make sure that these points that we use into these models are accurate and can be used. We developed a lot of bio-based layers that feed into these models. So we use the standard bioclimatic layers, but also the topographical layers, as I explained earlier, like slope, aspect, drainage, and soil type, line cover, and then also habitat quality layers created from remote sensing indices. So we don't have time today to go into that in detail, but we've really tried to create new layers that we can feed into these models to make them more accurate. We also do a verification process. So we, for instance, would look at the ACU values, the fixed cumulative values, all the graphs that Maxine produced to make sure that these models are accurate. And then we will also try and validate it against other independent data sources. We will, for instance, look at SABAP2 data, other data that we might have that were not included in the model. So there's various ways that we're trying to do that, and we also have started doing on-the-ground validation of these models. The final product is a TIFF file, a raster file, and these models cover South Africa, Eswatini, and Lesotho. We have removed unnatural areas, but not always. So for species that use unnatural areas, we can include the unnatural areas, for instance, blue cranes. So that again depends on what you want to do with the data and how you want to use it. The resolution currently is 1 hectare. Each cell in the raster contains a value between 0 and 1. So 0 is not suitable habitat, with 1 as suitable habitat. This data can be loaded in software such as ArcMap, ArcPro, or if you don't have these licensed software, you can use QGIS, which is free software. And you can then render the maps in the software and apply thresholds and play around with the data and use it however you want to use it. We've received requests in the past for KML files, but this is a flat file which will not indicate these different levels per cell, and therefore we feel that sharing KML files can lead to misinterpretation of the data, and therefore we prefer to use the raster files rather than a flat file like a KML file. So what can be the use of these layers? So on the left hand, I've just drawn an example. So we've got the model there for a grassland threatened bird species called rat's-lark. And as I said, if you draw your development footprint over the model, you can quite easily see if the species actually occur in that specific site, and also what part of the development is more suitable for the species and not. So I think this can be used really quite easy as a first level sort of assessment of a site to determine if those species are there or not. It's important to realize that we do not want to replace field assessment with these models. You still need to do a field assessment. So this is really a first layer to determine and to have a look as to what the potential species at the site might be. Our target species, we want to develop habitat suitability models for all our threatened and near threatened bird species, and also maybe some of our endemic bird species. We've currently developed models for 63 species, so that's everything above near threatened. That's for terrestrial bird species, not seabirds. We're currently only targeting terrestrial bird species. We've fed these data into the site screening tool, so by next year, all 63 models will be in the site screening tool. So just to explain here that for the site screening tool, we've applied really high thresholds so that just the core areas of these species are included in the site screening tool. We've also overlaid the data with SABAP2 data. So where the models overlap with SABAP2 data, we've added to the high sensitivity category within the site screening tool. So there's a confirmed presence of the species, and we've then showed where the species occur within that specific atlas pentad. And then for the rest, for some species, not for all of them, we've also included a medium category for the area where we don't have a confirmed presence of the species through SABAP2. So this is really important to understand that the site screening tool layers are really high thresholds and more specific. And so some of the areas which are on the periphery, for instance, of a species distribution will not be included in the site screening tool. But where it overlaps with SABAP2 data, all of that will be included in the site screening tool. So at BirdLife South Africa, we're quite keen to share these models with people that want to make use of them. But it's really important to understand that you need to understand how to use the layers. Since sharing this data, I realized that a lot of people don't have the software to actually load these raster layers into software, or don't have the GIS knowledge or skills to work with the layers. So it's really important that if you want to use the data, that you have some GIS knowledge and software like QGIS or ArcPro or ArcPoint or something like that. Otherwise, you will just not be able to use these maps correctly. We will share a metadata document with you if you want to do use the layers. That explains to you how they were developed and how they should be analyzed. And you will have to sign a once-off data sharing agreement with BirdLife South Africa. It's important that you understand the limitations of these maps. And it's also really great value if you can overlay the data with SABAP2. That just adds a lot of value to the layers. So if you also know how to do that, to download the SABAP2 data from the SABAP2 website and then overlay it with these layers, then that helps a lot. So in short then, that is a very, very short explanation of the habitat suitability models that we developed. We think it can be of great use. It would be interesting to hear how you think these layers can be used. As I said, you're more than welcome to contact me. There's my email address, ernst.retief@birdlife.org.za, and we can take the discussion further. Thank you very much.
Good day and welcome to my presentation today. I am Dr. Oliver Cowan from the Endangered Wildlife Trust's Conservation Science Unit, and today I will be talking about our recently developed Threatened Species No-Go map. Right, so in terms of presentation structure, first I'll provide a brief background to the project, essentially highlighting why there is a need for this tool. Then I shall address how we went about creating the No-Go map before presenting the map itself and describing some of its functionality. Finally, I will present an example of its applied usage in the form of cluster analysis for the identification of potential protected area expansion. When I presented on this topic at a conservation symposium, I skimmed over this first bullet point. However, perhaps it bears a little bit more emphasis here. South Africa is the third most biodiverse country in the world, with its assorted biomes home to a range of habitats, from the desert that extends down from Namibia in the northwest of the country to mangrove swamps further to the east, and of course the incomparable fynbos biome we have down here in the south. These habitats contain a multitude of unique and special species. Putting a precise number on the economic worth of our biodiversity is an impossible task, but when one considers the role it plays in our tourism sector, both in terms of the jobs it creates and the wealth it brings into the country, not to mention the value of ecosystem goods and services attached to functioning ecosystems, we are looking at a not insignificant amount, to put it mildly. As for the second bullet point, the shoe is somewhat on the other foot, and it would be tautological at this forum to spend any significant time describing the EIA process. Suffice it to say that it is key legislation in upholding the environmental rights enshrined in our very own constitution. On the final point, although I'm sure by now you're all well versed in the screening tool, as our work on it was the genesis, so to speak, of the no-go map, it may be relevant just to highlight some key concepts as they inform our understanding of the no-go map itself. The tool screens for a broad range of environmental sensitivities, including terrestrial plant and animal biodiversity, which is our focus today. There are currently over 340 animal and 4,600 plant species represented in the screening tool. The criteria for inclusion of a species is that they are listed as a species of conservation concern. In other words, critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable, according to the IUCN red listing process. The spatial data in the screening tool is assigned one of three sensitivity levels: very high, high, and medium. Very high sensitivity is critical habitat for range-restricted species of conservation concern that have a global range of less than 10 kilometers squared. High sensitivity is recent, in other words, post-2002, confirmed habitat for species of conservation concern, whereas medium sensitivity is suspected habitat for species of conservation concern based either on there being occurrence records for the species collected in the past prior to 2002, or being a natural area included in a habitat suitability model. Amongst other things, the screening tool also informs early stage decisions around avoidance, minimization, specialist requirements, and, in some cases, even early rejection of a proposed site as a viable development area. The intended purpose of the tool is to inform the placement of proposed potentially detrimental developments in order to encourage early stage rejection or avoidance before the EIA commencement, and in this way avoid unnecessary costs to the developer, the responding interested and affected parties, and as a result reduce irreversible loss or risk to the environment. Despite the conservation benefits that have accompanied the gazetting of the screening tool, there has been hesitancy from the department to explicitly identify areas which are highly unsuitable for development, and this application aims to address this directly. From the perspective of threatened and plant and animal diversity, this online app allows for rapid assessment of site sensitivity to inform the first stage of the mitigation hierarchy, that being avoidance. For a species to qualify for the no-go map, we followed a three-step process to filter the screening tool data. First, we included only data from the very high or high sensitivity categories. Second, we kept only species which were red listed under the IUCN's criteria B, C, and D. This ensures that the species in the map are facing threats directly related to habitat transformation and loss. Third, we calculated the total geographic area of the polygons in the screening tool layers and retained species which had a total of less than or equal to 25 square kilometers. This therefore identifies species for which we have confirmed occurrence records from an extremely restricted area. The map, as it stands, contains spatial data on 15 amphibian species, 4 spider species, 2 birds, 59 insect species, 5 invertebrates, 20 mammals, 7 reptiles, and over 1,700 plant species. It is designed for rapid assessment and ease of use, two characters not exactly inherent in the current iteration of the screening tool. Furthermore, our application allows mapping on a species-by-species level, and we provide multiple ways to identify whether a property contains sensitive threatened species. I should add that although the screen grab of the home screen appears to show large tracts of land classified as no-go, this is just a function of scale, and should you zoom into a finer scale, you would see that the parcels of land are actually very limited in size. Although we are confident in the easy-to-use functionality of the online map and encourage accessing it using the link provided in blue, we have also created a video demo which walks one through the app and how best to use it. The video can be accessed on EWT's YouTube channel or by taking a screenshot of the QR code provided on screen. Don't worry, if you're a bit slow on the draw, the QR code will also be made available again on the final slide. Although the no-go map was created as a tool to inform prospective developers, EAPs, and the general public about areas of very high sensitive biodiversity importance based on threatened animal and plant data, we subsequently realized that the tool, or rather the data contained within the tool, has use for applied conservation. The map on screen is the result of a hotspot analysis showing regions of the country with the densest distribution of no-go areas. In the example I will provide today, we can use the data contained within the no-go map to help guide protected area expansion. The species represented in the no-go areas are oftentimes the most at risk of extinction due to their extremely limited distribution. Identifying pockets or clusters of these areas, currently with no formal protection, is an important first step in identifying areas where protected area expansion would be most beneficial. What we have done is to set up a model which isolates all no-go areas outside of the South African protected area estate and sets user-controlled parameters to identify clusters. The parameters to be set are the minimum amount of no-go polygons required to form a cluster, and the minimum distance between two no-go polygons to consider them part of the same cluster. The map on screen now shows all no-go areas in red, overlaid on top of protected areas in green. In this map, we set the model with a buffer of 250 meters around protected areas to account for any inaccuracies in their delineation, and set the minimum features at 20 and the minimum distance between polygons at 20 kilometers. I should also add that this iteration of the model only includes animals, not plants. As you can see, it identifies 10 hotspots or clusters, which would benefit most from increased protection. Here is the result of the same parameters, but including the 1,747 plant species contained within the no-go map. This doubles the total number of hotspots, but their location across the country is actually pretty similar. I should add that the model also generates tables, including details on the species and number of individual no-go polygons present within each hotspot. However, in my experience, maps make a better accompaniment to a presentation than graphs.
To conclude, we used the animal and plant sensitivity layers from the environmental screening tool to create an open access, easy to use tool to identify areas most critical for the protection of the most range restricted species of conservation concern. Although all these areas are present in the original screening tool, the powers that be are reticent to explicitly state any area is officially a no-go area. We hope that this provides a resource for responsible developers and EAPs to essentially regard these areas as no-goes, in the knowledge that any proposed developments will likely be subject to stringent opposition by the conservation community. Once again, the QR code to the video demo is shown in the top left of your screen, and if you'd like to contact myself or my colleagues with regard to the no-go maps, please see the email addresses on screen. That's it from me. Thanks for joining and have a great day further.
Hi everyone, it's Francisco Bachi Cervantes, and I want to talk about this project that we've been working on at the Fitzpatrick Institute, me as a postdoc together with Professor Arjun Amar and Dr. Megan Murgatroyd from Hawkwatch International to elaborate this risk map for the Cape Vulture in the context of the wind energy development. We haven't done this alone. We've got a number of co-authors and collaborators from different organizations that have contributed very valuable data and have helped along the way to elaborate these maps. So South Africa plans to install about 18 gigawatts of very much needed wind energy by 2030. And we must just take into consideration that South Africa is also home for the Cape Vulture, which is an endangered species that is restricted to South Africa and the neighboring countries. And it is a species that has undergone severe declines in past years, and that we know that might be, or actually vultures are vulnerable to collisions. And so we must be careful when we plan where to place these wind farms, not to create further problems to this species in the process. So if we look at the map that we have for the distribution of the Cape Vulture, extracted from the Red Data Book of Birds and elaborated by David Allen in 2015, in relation to the preferential development areas for renewable energy, we see that there might be some overlap between the known distribution of the species and the preferential areas for development. So our objective was to identify areas that are important for the Cape Vulture, using different type of data, and we'll see if we could make a more detailed map and also update the existing information, and also see how our new map compares to what we have at the moment. So to elaborate this risk map, we've used tracking data. So we've used information that comes from vultures that have a GPS tracker and send locations. And we've used a total of 68 vultures that have been tracked since 2005 up until basically now, not necessarily continuously all the vultures. So there might be vultures that were tracked back in the day and now vultures that have been tracked more recently. And if we look at panel A, we see what is more or less the distribution of those locations that we have. So dark colors represent a higher density of locations, and light colors represent less density of locations in the raw data. This is in the log scale, but it's not important. It's just darker colors just mean higher densities. The same happens here. This is the colony data that we have. Darker colors indicate bigger colonies, so more vultures in the colonies. And so we observe in the southeast, there is more colonies. There seem to be more squares with colonies, but in the northeast, this colony seems to be bigger. Now, if we look at the two figures, there seem to be some mismatch, for example, here in Namibia, where we've got a lot of vulture activity, but we only have one colony. And this is because the tracking of these birds wasn't really designed to infer a population level activity distribution. So it is not a sample that might be representative of the population. So we've just collated all this information, we've put it together from different projects to try and figure out what the vulture is doing. So, but we do need some modeling and some analysis to come up with that distribution. And so our modeling approach has been the following. So we've got this telemetry data, the colony data, and we've also used some environmental data, like different elements in the landscape, orographic measures such as altitude or slope, and we've used this environmental data to fit models. So we've fitted a step selection model, which is a habitat use model. This will inform us how these vultures use the habitats and the different elements in the landscape. And we've also fitted a flight height model, which models the probability that a vulture is going to fly at the height of a turbine blade. With these models, so with the step selection model and using the known colony locations, we can simulate steps, we can simulate activity of the vultures around the colonies. And with those steps, or for each of those steps, we can estimate the probability that that step is going to be at a height that might be of risk. So at the height of a turbine, basically, attending to these environmental covariates that we talked before. Once we've simulated these many steps, we can just count how many steps of those fall into each of the pixels of an image. And then that will give us the relative frequency with which that pixel would be expected to be visited by the vultures, right? And then we get this gradient of activity, and we do the same thing for these points. Well, if instead of counting the points, we actually we sum those probabilities corresponding to each point, then we would get also a relative frequency, but only of those flights that are expected to occur at the height of the wind turbine. And so that would give us the same version of the activity distribution, but now at rotor height. And finally, we take our information about colony size and we scale the distribution of activity according to the size of the colony. So colonies with a greater amount of birds would accumulate more activity than those without, or with the small size, with fewer birds. So just to be clear of how this works, so if we have a colony that has close to 1,300 birds, and we've got another colony, colony A, and we've got another colony, colony B, that only has 24 individuals, and we define this activity distribution around colony A and this activity distribution around colony B. If we ignore the size of the colony and we just take the average of this hazard, or we add both hazards, then we get an activity that looks like this, right? This would give us the probability that a bird would be found in this area if there was one bird in colony A and one bird in colony B. But now if we consider the amount of birds that, that each of the colonies has, so colony A would basically accumulate most of the activity, and colony B would basically disappear. And these are our final maps. We've got the map and scaled, so without considering the size of the colonies, and we've got this scaled map. So this, we call it the hazard map, and we call this the risk map, because we're considering the exposure of the population. And we can see that these colonies in the northeast accumulate a lot more risk if we consider the size of the colonies. So some final considerations. We did favor the 2D risk map over the 3D risk map for site screening purposes. So we favor that model that doesn't really consider the height of the flights for different reasons, because there's more modeling involved in estimating the 3D distribution. And so there's more assumptions and it's more error prone. And also we tested the models, and the 2D model seemed to do quite well at predicting data that the model hadn't seen. But the 3D model, although had an acceptable performance, it wasn't as good. And so for site screening purposes, we would prefer that, you know, if there could be vultures flying around, even if it was at a height that is above the wind turbines, we would be cautious and send people to monitor the site and make sure that the place is safe. Now we say all models are wrong, following the quote by George Box's famous quote, but we hope that these are useful. We don't claim that this is the actual distribution of the Cape Vulture, but we think it is a map that is well informed, and it should work well in most cases, although we might have failed to capture something. For example, these models are quite sensitive to the accuracy of the colony data. So if we miss the colony, for example, there would just be an empty space there without any estimated activity, because all the activity is simulated around colonies. And similarly, if the size of the colony was not correctly estimated, then the relative weight of those colonies would be wrong. In any case, we've done our best to collect most, or the most of the information out there about colonies, and we've tried to come up with a robust database. In any case, we've built these maps in a way that can be updated. If new or better information becomes available, we've developed an R package that can relatively easily update the maps. And just to remind you that there are other maps similar for the verdant vulture, and there are plans to map other species such as the black harry. So thanks a lot. I want to again acknowledge all our collaborators and co-authors. They've been working on vulture conservation and tracking birds and counting colonies for a very long time, and it has made possible this work. And we also want to acknowledge our funders, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much again to all of our speakers. And if our speakers or those who are answering questions on behalf of our speakers could again turn on their cameras. I see that Cape Vulture needs to run off soon, so I'm going to ask this question first, and I suppose this is directed at Francisco. So she says, on the CV model, how do you take into account the movements of vultures between colonies, i.e. we know the pairs can move from one colony to another. When you take the number of birds in each colony, is this a hard rule, as this number can and does fluctuate? For example, when the release of captive bred Cape vultures in the Eastern Cape, there are many more sightings now in the Eastern Cape, and this may not be reflected in your model. How can your model be used for these variations and fluctuations? My worry on this model is that it becomes a hard rule, but movement patterns are changing.
Yeah, it's like many questions in one. I would say, okay, first of all, yes. So there might be seasonal variations, and there might be variations over time, even variations from or across a single day. Like there might be more activity close to the colonies in the morning and evenings. So we've come up with something that could be considered like an average or an expected long-term distribution of activity, not a time explicit thing. So yes, we want to capture fluctuations in time. We expect to include those in an integrated, say, or expected long-term figure. Then movement between colonies. We don't make our vultures in the simulations move between colonies. We acknowledge that there might be those kind of movements, but we consider like a steady state system again, in which vultures are allocated to a single colony and move around that colony. Yeah, so we might miss if the vultures move between two colonies that are very far away. We might miss that specific movement. But now, once the bird has arrived to the other colony and started to move around there, then that would be captured as well.
Great, thanks, Francisco. And now that you've warmed up your vocal cords on answering that question, I'm going to ask a couple of others that are directed at you. So Paul Martin asks, he says, for the vulture model, movements or occurrence relied on telemetry results. Why wasn't SABAP2 data included?
We didn't include SABAP2. Do you mean like as covariate, for example? That could have been an idea, and we did think about doing that. We just thought we would keep the model a little bit clean from other complex variables and just use like raw, let's say, variables to construct the models. But we did compare how the model performs in relation to the SABAP distribution, and it quite agrees with it.
Great, thanks. And then Sean Taylor asks, for the flight height model parameters, what were the turbine parameters used out of interest?
We used 300 meters as a threshold. So anything under 300 meters would be considered the height of a turbine. We know it's a little bit higher than the average turbine, but we wanted to give some room, firstly because the readings of the GPS tags are not 100% accurate, and so there are some errors in the actual measurement, and also because turbines are growing quite quickly, so we wanted to give some room for new models.
Great, thanks very much. Ian, a question regarding EWT's no-go map, and well done on your work on this. That's really interesting. So I suppose my question is how far would EWT, or should one take their objection to developments in a no-go area? And I suppose perhaps this depends on what you mean by no-go and how you define that. Obviously, even protected areas allow for some kinds of development.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks. I think you kind of answered the question yourself right at the end there. It depends on what kind of development it is. So each case needs to be dealt with individually. So we ultimately need to look at what species are driving that no-go, and whether the proposed development in question will have a detrimental impact on that species. I mean, these are all driven by highly localized threatened species. So most developments will have a significant impact on the population and potentially on the species as a whole, but that needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis. So they are no-goes, but as with all things, they need to be dealt with individually and by discretion. So some common sense and logic needs to be taken into account.
Thanks very much, Ian. Yeah, Sam, a question for you in light of these past presentations. Do you have intentions to update BirdLife South Africa's Cape Vulture guidelines?
Yes, just like we updated the Burroughs Eagle guidelines. I think once Patchy's models finalized and updated, we will definitely look at updating our guidelines. Yeah, I think it might be a little bit too soon just yet, but absolutely, we try to make sure that they're based on the best available information possible.
Great, and then I suppose a question for Patchy, but perhaps also Dr. Fisher wants to weigh in on this if she's still online. What do you think are the prospects of including collision maps in the screening tool?
We are actually we've talked with Dee and Ernst and Sam to actually try and include these maps into the screening tool and build some sensitivity layers for vultures. It's still not clear how exactly they're gonna go in, but yeah, we are working on it.
Brilliant, thanks very much. So that is all of the questions that I've received so far for this session. I'm just looking at the remaining questions from the previous session. I think that our speakers have done a great job of providing written answers, so please keep an eye on those. But I'd just like to ask any of the speakers from today's sessions whether they have any final comments based on these questions and discussions that have been raised, and please do feel free to raise your hand. Yes, Ian.
Yeah, just an observation, and I think both Sam and Christy alluded to it earlier in the day. That and speaking to Christy's pattern maps that she was referring to, and I mean we're also, I suppose, guilty of creating these pattern maps, and they're very useful in terms of identifying sensitive areas and areas where we shouldn't develop. But perhaps we should be turning our focus in the opposite direction. in terms of developing pattern maps that identify where renewables should be. So looking for those least sensitive areas so that we can inform development rather than trying to inform where development shouldn't go. So by doing what we've kind of been guilty of doing, creating all these maps of areas where development shouldn't go, we're creating a competition environment. Whereas we should actually be creating an environment where we can work with developers to identify areas where renewables need to go. And we're all keen on renewable energy, and we're all keen on this transition. So I think we should maybe all start thinking about shifting that focus to trying to drive collaboration as opposed to competition.
And offering solutions rather than just pointing out problems. Yeah, Sam, I see you put your hand up. Would you like to comment on that? Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, I completely agree with Ian, and I think we need to be very cautious about creating this green versus green debate. And at the same time, I think government and industry need to be very cautious about putting the responsibility of drawing the line to protect the environment just on NGOs like BirdLife South Africa and EWT. But our challenge is to gather with industry and the Department of Energy, Department of Environment, everybody coming to a table and creating a shared vision of what we think sustainable development of renewable energy is in South Africa, and then charting a path together about how to get there. It's a dangerous situation to keep us in our little silos like we tend to be.
Thanks very much, Sam. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on this? If not, I think I'm going to start wrapping up, as I see a few people have already indicated they need to run, and we're a few minutes away from our scheduled closure. First of all, I just wanted to ask Karoo, can you show the poll results so we can see? Okay, so this is the poll that we ran at the beginning of today's session, so you can get a sense of how today's audience was composed. Thank you very much for all of you for joining us. It's fantastic to see good representation from the renewable energy industry, and then of course from EAP specialists, NGOs, and representation from governments as well. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Hopefully we see a good bunch of you in tomorrow's session as well. So just a reminder that tomorrow we're going to be looking at essentially issues surrounding monitoring, mitigation, and environmental enhancements. And thank you very much for all of you to joining us. A very, very warm thank you for all of our speakers and for the efforts that you put into your presentations. And I hope that you all have a brilliant afternoon, and to see you all tomorrow. Thank you.